Hello and welcome to episode 186 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco and I am flying solo for this intro and the outro of this episode as Tarek is otherwise engaged, but he is involved in the main interview, you'll be pleased to hear. If this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, thank you. This is a podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds to hear about their writing journeys, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And there are now incredibly over 185 episodes. I say incredibly because when Tarek and I started this, we never even thought we would get to 10, never mind 186 as episode today is. But there are a lot of great authors and also industry experts that we've spoken to in the past there, and screenwriters and many other types of writers. So please do go and check those out if you haven't already. But today we have another great guest. We're speaking to Jasper Fforde, who is the critically acclaimed author of a whole variety of books, which I would term as some of the most imaginative books, imaginative concepts for books that I've heard of in a long time. He's got the Nursery crime series, which is all about sort of treating nursery rhymes as real-life crime stories. He's got the Thursday Next novels, which is a character that sort of goes through different books trying to solve stuff. And his latest book is Redside Story, which is a sequel to Shades of Grey, which he wrote some time ago. And we speak to him about coming back to a series after so long. And we also talk about his long journey into becoming a writer. He had, like many people, to deal with some initial rejections and the importance of persistence in writing. And he tells us about some of his writing tenets, including things like a narrative dare, where he effectively dares himself to continue with an idea that he's had. And it's a really interesting episode. Jasper's a really fun and interesting guy, and to hear how he developed some of these unique ideas was incredible. So I'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, and I will be back very briefly at the end of the podcast just to let you know about what's coming up on the podcast. But as Tarek would say, for now, on with the podcast. The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
I always start the podcast with the same question, which is, did you always want to be a writer? Because I think I'm right in saying that you worked in film for a while before you were published.
No, I became a writer completely by accident. Uh, it was yeah, it's rather odd. Okay, so I worked in the film industry, and when you work in the film industry, of course, you want to be a film director and make your own movies and everything. And in those days, it was quite terrific. Quite difficult because you had to actually buy film and you had to process film, so it was quite an expensive thing to do. So you couldn't really waste any time. So to waste any money. So the idea was to have a really good script, right? This was you know, this is the first thing you learn is that script is everything, and then it's acting, and then possibly direction, and then something else, sound. Very high on the list, actually. If you can't hear people, it's rubbish. So I was writing film scripts originally to make into movies. And then somebody said, look, why don't you write a treatment of the script you're trying to make, a short story, so that you can get like the atmosphere and the pace and the characters and a bit of dialogue, and you can make it sort of work in that kind of way. The Third Man, the movie The Third Man, the script was Graham Greene, and he did exactly that. That was his technique. So the short story, the novella, The Third Man, is actually a treatment. Him writing a treatment
Oh, right. Okay.
to yeah. I mean, it's a great idea. I mean, I think it's a really good idea.
That's cool.
So anyway, so I was writing this treatment, and I was sort of writing it away on my typewriter, clack clackety clack, 'cause it was a while ago, and then I was sort of, and then this thing emerged from the wordage, that some of the words were actually falling into the right order, and they were clustering in attractive groups, if you like, which I think is what writing is kind of all about. That they because a word on its own is like just like the building block of story, but once you start putting them together, and you can make exciting things happen. And all of a sudden this seemed to be happening on the page in front of me, and I was going, oh, okay, I quite like this. I could do some of this. Maybe it's not, it was, some of it was barely rubbish at all, and and I kind of thought, for the first time in my life, because I thought that writing was something that clever people did, because I was terrible at school. I was an undiagnosed dyslexic, which we don't get so much these days, because I was schooled in the 70s, where you had to be really dyslexic, and then it was called word blindness, and you could barely read or write at all. But for the rest of us who have mild dyslexia, which is found these days, I had that, and never knew it. I didn't know until in my 50s, really, when I was having one of my kids tested. And of course, everything is much more explainable then. So for me, writing was something that smart people did who were good at school, because I was terrible at school. So this revelation at the age of 27, 1988, was very exciting for me. And I never made the films. I didn't need to, because all of a sudden you don't need film sets, you don't need budgets, you don't need actors, you don't need locations, you don't need caterers, you don't need the honey wagon. You can just build these wonderful, fantastic worlds on your own, in your own head, with 26 letters and 7 different punctuation marks. And I just fell in love with the purity of the written word there and then, and that's how it happened.
But I think I'm right in saying...
Then I was going to add, but then there was a 13-year wait whilst I tried to get it from barely crap at all to faintly marketable, and that's my kind of writer's story in a nutshell. So, cup of tea and some cake. I think we're done. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Well, I was going to ask about that, because obviously, yeah. So I suppose the writing bug caught you at that age, but it did take a while before you were published. And I think I read that you were the EYRE Affair was rejected 76 times. Is that right?
Yeah, I think all my work was rejected. I did count them up, but it was over 13 years. So if you work out the average, I clearly wasn't sending that many letters out,
right?
To be honest.
Okay. But I suppose what I always ask about that, for the sake of listeners that are in that process now, is how do you motivate yourself to keep going at that stage when all you're getting back is rejections at that stage?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you you kind of redefine rejection. I think that's probably the best way because it's not someone saying, the rejections didn't say, "Dear Jasper Fforde, I think your writing is really hopeless. I think you should never pick up a pen again. Go away. We hate you. Everyone hates you." It's not that level of rejection. It's more, we're kind of not interested, or our client list is full. That's one that comes around a lot. Actually, it's quite a good one. Or we didn't fall sufficiently in love. That was one of the nicest, softest rejection letters ever. And I think the way that you view it and the way that I felt I should view it is in many ways, when your kids or whatever say, "Oh, I can't do this," and you go, "Yet." You just put "yet" on the end, I can't do. You go, "No, you can't do it yet. You can't do it yet." And I think the way to look at it is that you're not ready yet. That all skills, whatever they are, take time to learn. They take time to hone. And when you're being rejected, what you're actually doing is you're trying to figure out how to write, and you're teaching yourself. And this is just along the way, you're going, "Am I kind of there yet?" And they're going, "No, not yet, but keep going." And I think that's kind of the way to look at it, really, is you're just trying to train yourself. I mean, equate it with learning to, play the trombone. I mean,
Yeah.
but the notes are terrible, but after 10, 15 years, you can really start to blow that horn. So it's just like any other skill. It's a skill you have to learn, and there's no other way but to keep at it,
And those years when you were getting the rejections and stuff, and you were sticking with it. Were you working on the book still? And were you editing it still? Were you taking advice? Were you feedback? Were you making it better, or were you just putting it out there?
I'm not an author who comes from I suppose. I mean, I came from film and reading. Obviously, I mean, it's an interesting place where you come from. If you come from an area of like going to festivals, you see, I didn't go to any literary festivals until I was actually an author. So it wasn't something I naturally did. And I didn't go to reading and writing groups. I didn't join any of those, nothing like that. I was just kind of sitting on my own, trying to sort of figure it out together. And I figuring out on by myself. And I think what works really well, and authors are very strange and slightly damaged people, I think, and you have a sense that you're not very good and that you want to prove yourself, and those sort of crushing feelings of low self-worth when you're a teenager, you can really make them work for you when you're trying to get better as a writer. And I know maybe sounds a little bit counterintuitive, because you're constantly trying to make it better, and you're looking at your work and you're thinking, "Fforde, this is terrible. It really doesn't read very well. You've got to make it better. You really have." And I think there's a strange little furnace there. There's a little engine that drives this sense of wanting to be better, that I think you kind of have to have as an author, and you've got to be your own best and worst critic, all at the same time. And I sort of equate it to this sort of strange idea of front and back of house. Front of house is thinking, "Hey, I've got this great idea about, rabbits or hibernation or something." And then there's back of house when you're writing, and you're writing this sentence and you read it back to yourself and you go, "There's something not right there, but I don't know what it is." But you've got to listen to that voice. And I think that's your little internal critic going, "Fforde, keep not quite right." And then when you get it right, you go, "Yeah, that works." That works, and you carry on. And it's kind of listening to that little sort of critical inner voice. And that's what I did for whatever it took me, 12, 13 years to find.
I think that's such a good point. That idea of that kind of reading your own work and that thought of, as you read a sentence or a paragraph, this isn't reading right, and it's not clicking. This is clunky, or it's taking me out of it, or I'm tripping over it, the meaning of it when I've come back to it fresh. And I think if you ignore that, that's a mistake. And I think it is a case really of just working through it until those sections are gone, or you don't have that thing jumping out, you seeing fixes?
The only thing I would say is that I think writers can tend to be, because of what you were saying, actually, they can tend to be overly critical, almost, in the sense that they'll always think that there's something they can do to make something better.
Yes,
and
that's
better,
also that's the flip side.
try
That's
and
also
rework
true,
something.
yeah,
And I suppose
yeah.
you need to be careful not to get caught in that
absolutely.
cycle as well.
Yeah, I mean, writing is never, you never finish anything, you abandon it.
Yeah.
And even when I'm going and giving talks, and I'm reading, maybe doing a short reading, and as I'm reading it, I'm editing on the fly, and I'm going, okay, that word doesn't work. I'm going to leave that one out, and you're still doing it,
Yeah.
And I try not to read my books back again. To me, I mean, to myself, like my first book, if I read it now, I'd go, okay, it kind of works on some levels, but
Yeah.
and that's good, because if you've written a short story or a paragraph or just something or a little ditty or something like that, and you come back to it, maybe a month later or 2 months later or a year later, and you go, oh, this is awful, and it's go, fantastic. That is absolutely where you want to be, because you've learned something in that intervening period, and you're gonna make it better. It's always get better.
Yeah.
And so how did you end up finding your agent then with the first book then? Was it just a case of sort of slowly honing it and making it better, and then eventually someone bit when you sent it in?
Yeah. So what I was doing is I wrote my I have these two nursery crime police procedural books. So they're police procedurals, but with nursery rhyme characters. So Humpty Dumpty, Who Killed Humpty Dumpty, essentially, the Big Over Easy it's called. And then I did the Three Bears as a missing persons case. So it was about Goldilocks, who's an investigative reporter who goes missing.
Brilliant.
And I did those two, and then they were my first books, and I was sending them around and everything. And then I did something called The Last Dragonslayer, as sort of my take on magic. And then I did this other one called The EYRE, which was about Thursday Next. This person who can travel inside fiction, and she has to get, Jane Eyre is kidnapped out of her own book, and she has to get it back. So what I did, I had these kind of 4 books, and I think I had another one at the time, and I kind of jumped between them. And I sort of revolved between them. And I used to go back to one book. And I remember spending like 6 weeks rewriting the front of the Big Over Easy. And I sent that off again to see if anyone was interested, and they weren't. And then I went back to the EYRE. And I think eventually I submitted The Last Dragonslayer, which was a sort of 70,000 worder kind of young adult idea. And I submitted that to a whole bunch of agents, one of whom was actually coincidentally starting an agency. Right, this was Janklow Nesbitt UK when they were starting up, and she had no clients, so she was reading everything because not everything gets read. They'll read the first page or the first paragraph, and you can tell a lot by that first paragraph. And she read this, and she gave me a call, and it was like, oh my God. She gave me a call and said, okay, Jasper, I really kind of like this. It's quirky and weird and kind of off kilter, and it's really kind of not what we're reading at the moment. But unfortunately, there's another book about wizards, which is currently doing the rounds. And this was Harry Potter, the third one was out. And she said, look, it's just going to look like a Me Too book. And it's not a Me Too book, but it's going to look like a Me. I mean, not the modern iteration of Me Too, but you know what I mean. And you get a lot of those. It's like, when E.L. James had the phenomenal thing.
Yeah.
Tons of books were coming up very similar, and they just get swamped. So she said, what else have you got? Which is, one of those, real sort of pivot there. And I've been working on the EYRE, and that was kind of very off-kilter book. And I think the police procedural Humpty Dumpty one was kind of more of a safer bet. But I thought to myself, no, this is my first big chance. So let's really go with my book, the one that I felt is really, really reflects a kind of bizarre worldview. And it's not to market. And, we can talk about this later about not writing to market.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely one of those books. And I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound, to hell with it, and I sent her the EYRE. And we had a sale within 4 weeks on that, because because it was not to market, because it was very, very off kilter. This is the end of this came out in 2001. So it's the end of the 90s, which was a kind of decade of ladlit and chicklit, and that was kind of going off the boil. And I think it was kind of right. That kind of mashup hadn't really started. And I think people were ready for something new and exciting and a bit different. But I suppose I should also mention, and this kind of clues into the kind of not to market thing, is that I wrote The EYRE Affair, which was just me sort of firing off in all directions in an imaginative world. It's a kind of 7-year-old basically just having fun with anything that interests me. And I wrote that because the two, what I call my conventional books, the nursery rhyme police procedurals, no one was showing any interest. So I was thinking, there's a possibility here I'm not ever going to be published. So what the hell, do my own thing. And that was a huge release because it was me basically saying to myself, you just write your own stuff, Final Cut, you got Final Cut Fforde. No one's going to read it. It doesn't matter. And that became the one that has given me a, whatever he is now, 23-year career and 17 books later.
Yeah.
A book that I just, and I mean, it was kind of weird.
You called them, I think you used the word conventional there when you talked about your other books, and one of which was the Nursery Rhyme detective series. But I mean, they don't sound very conventional. They sound very unique and imaginative. And I have to say, I have, kind of like a Douglas Adams-y kind of vibe to some of them, and that kind of real breaking the fourth wall a little bit, kind of quite meta. And where do you get all the ideas from? And it's a horrible question, and I know people hate getting asked it, but they are so unique, these ideas and these stories. How do you generate the ideas? What's your process there?
I think the process is, to me, they're not unusual ideas. To me, this is what's going on inside, my head. And I don't mean that in a sort of boasty kind of way. It's just how I'm wired, and I think the dyslexia has probably had something to do with it. And maybe mild ADHD. I'm not sure. For me, it's kind of two things. It's that you can take two ideas together and you merge them, and then something very exciting springs off in that union. And the other one is what I call the logical progression of an idea. I have all these kind of slightly grand things that I call sort of tenets to write by. But the logical progression of idea is a really sort of quite good way of thinking of things. Because what you do is you say, what if Humpty Dumpty were murdered? Now, many people might just say, yeah, what if? That's quite an interesting idea. What if he was pushed? And it goes, and then you start thinking about it, and you start going, okay, who'd investigate a crime like that? And why would Humpty Dumpty be in our world anyway? If it was set in our world, why would he be there? Do we need to create a different world in which nursery rhyme characters are just there? Shall we set it in Reading? Do we need a nursery crime division? Right. Yes, we do.
Brilliant.
That's a sort of small, underfunded division of the Reading Police Department, and it's probably run by nursery rhyme characters. So what about Jack Sprat? Right. Yeah. Why not? And Mary, who's obviously quite contrary. And all of a sudden, it keeps on. It just starts snowballing, and you go, okay, how was he murdered? And we have to have that scene in the pathology lab where they're sticking his shell back together again, and to work out the cracks. And perhaps he was shot, and you can find an entry wound and an exit wound. And then I quickly do some research on hydrostatic shock waves of the bullets going through liquids, and you realize that a large egg of that size would completely explode. And then you kind of think, it's a very odd idea, but you want it to be real because this is the whole idea of a fantastical story. And this was what Terry used to say, is that you've got to make the unusual mundane in fantasy. That's essentially what you're doing, because the people in the book, to them, it's completely normal. They're not going, no one in the Lord of the Rings is going, hey, isn't it amazing? We're in this world where there's like magic and rings and eagles and stuff. They're not saying that. They're to them it's real life. So I thought, right, well, you create this alternative world, and then you're kind of in that way in which, the place to hide a stick is in a forest, right? No one ever will find a stick in a forest, no way. And the way to hide a very unusual idea is in a sea of other unusual ideas. So all of a sudden, the fact that Humpty Dumpty is in a world where there are nursery rhyme characters, just doing their thing, makes the central idea kind of almost ordinary and acceptable. So there's a kind of little smoke and mirrors subterfuge. But that's my thought process, how to make this work. Where do we go with this idea? And also the idea of taking two ideas. You've got police procedurals, you've got Humpty Dumpty, you put them together, bing, what do you get? I mean, Oxford and Cambridge boat race, not very fun. Well, it is when someone sinks, and it's very funny. Is not particularly funny. Flying boats, great fun, flying boats, great fun. What about if we had the Oxford versus Cambridge flying boat race? To me, that sounds like a great idea. We have these two huge flying boats lumbering down the Thames at 20 foot, where they're sort of throwing things at one another to try and win. So you just take ideas Monty Python. If there's any reference, I suppose, central reference to any of those books about having fun with the literary characters that I do, about Jane Eyre being kidnapped with Jane Eyre. It's Wuthering Heights by Semaphore Flag and Julius Caesar by Aldislight. And that's exactly what I mean about taking two ideas, Julius Caesar, Aldis lamp, and you go, put them together and tell the story. The Aldis lamp is the signalling lamp, click, 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 et tu Brutus. And by that, you can see just how two entirely separate, completely different ideas, you bring them together, and there's something wonderful and exciting and new and original that you can play with.
And do these ideas in that process, does it start off as a spark of idea, or does it all sort of come to you at once, or do you just let it bubble in your head for a while before deciding if it's one that you can move forward with?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, one of the other tenets I work by is something called the narrative dare, in which I set myself a narrative dare, right? So I wrote a book about humans always hibernating called Early Riser. And the narrative dare with that was write a thriller set in a world in which humans have always hibernated. Right. So the really key word in that sentence is always. So we are fundamentally different socially, physiologically, economically, everything. So then I sit down and you start writing, and you start writing the world, and all the ideas start slotting into place using that logical progression of the idea. The fun thing about a narrative dare is it's a dare, right? So you can't back out, right? It's like being dared by your older brother to jump off the roof of the house. You have to do it. You can't back out. So you can never let yourself off the hook, right? I've never started a narrative dare I didn't finish, because that's the whole point of a narrative dare. Because, when it comes to writing, there is no idea too dumb or too stupid or too silly that can't be made to work using the right approach. And the narrative dare approach allows you can't let yourself off the hook. So you've got to rummage really deep in that authorial toolbox to find the narrative process in which you could make this idea function. So with the Early Riser book, I started writing, and I started writing the world first, because that's often what I do is I have a sort of idea and I write the world first. And then you start exploring that world and seeing how that world functions. And in the way in which that world functions, you find new ways of finding drama. You're not using drama that we have in the real world, although you can. There are new and sort of slightly unique ways of finding the story and the drama. And sometimes the plot doesn't actually really come to me until, I'm sort of third or half the way through the book, because I'm exploring where this idea takes me. And then the drama and the ideas and the everything starts dropping into place.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that process, especially the sort of narrative dare process, can keep the writing itself interesting and exciting for you. Whereas if you were someone that was writing a police or two police procedurals a year or something, then I would find that quite boring eventually once you got into the routine of it. But I wanted to ask a bit, I suppose, linked to that, about your process. Then, about it sounds to me like you're not someone that will sit down and outline something beforehand. You'll have the idea, you'll go and you'll sort of discover it by writing. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I cannot plan my books. I mean, I always kind of sort of semi-joke that if you're reading one of my books and you've got no idea where it's going, then don't worry, neither did I. And sometimes the ending of the last book I wrote, Redside Story, it appeared within the last week of writing the book. Oh, wow. And I like the ending. I think it works really well. So yeah, there's a lot of experimentation, but essentially what I kind of do is whenever I'm starting writing a book, I want to get 20,000 words down straight away, right? So, maybe, 1,500, 2,000 words a day. They don't have to be good words. They just have to kind of roughly kind of work. It really helps to have something to work with. I find that, you got 20,000 words. That's a good chunk of change on the screen to work with. So I do that. And they're not particularly good, but they're not, massively awful. And they're not just, it's sort of, I don't know. Yeah, they're just not
completely
just repetitive.
Random. Yeah, exactly.
Completely random. I was trying to remember the name of the character in The Shining, Jack, so and so, who kept writing the same sentence.
Yeah.
So then I go back to the beginning, and then I start combing through it, and then the kind of ideas start coming, and I think, okay, no, this is working. What if the character did this? And then I try it, and it goes, and I go, yeah, okay, that works. And maybe it doesn't, and I go, no, let's try something else. So for me, writing is a very sort of almost experimental, and I think it means I write for every 100,000 book I write, I must write 700,000-800,000 words as I explore narrative avenues, that could end up as total dead ends, but sometimes actually work. So then I get to 30,000 words, and I think, okay, that's pretty good. Then I go back to the beginning, and then I start trawling through it again, and I kind of, with the flow of it, because I think if you were to write 100,000 words, the pace and the tempo might be a little bit up and down because you haven't been through it that many times. But when I go back to the beginning again, then I start combing it through, and then I smooth out, the narrative, and add a few more things, get rid of things. I can change this, and then I change that all the way through to the end of that 30,000, and then I go over the end, and I get to 40,000, and I go back to the beginning.
Right.
So I'm constantly going through the book. And sometimes, when I get to the end of the book and I'm up that, 110,000 word, usually my books come out at like 150,000 words at first draft. And I get to 110, and then I go back, and it can take me 5-6 weeks to get back to where I was, the narrative horizon, as I call it. But then I go over again, and eventually I end up with my 140,000 words, which is 150,000 words, which is kind of okay. And then I go through and I try and remove as many words as I can with the last one, and just to tighten it up, make it pacey, and often have new ideas.
That kind of experimental approach is a fascinating way to write, and it must throw up so many different ideas and stuff that you hadn't thought about when you first started, and if you hadn't kept on going over and over, you would never come to it. But then how does that work in terms of when you pitch an idea to a publisher and say, this is my next idea, and they say, we love it, write that book, and then you give them a book and it's nothing like it. You say, well, I started off like that, and then I did draft 12 and it became something different, and they say, this is bizarre. Yeah. How does that work?
I think they have to kind of get to know you.
Yeah.
My editor recently moved from Hodder to another publisher, and I didn't go with her. I'm still at Hodder. We worked together for 16 years, and she knew pretty much exactly how I wrote. And when I said, I'm going to do this book about rabbits, and I just sort of gave an idea to her, she said, terrific, go ahead and do it. And even when I give her the first draft, she would often give me very broad brushstrokes because she knew I'd go away and completely change everything on the rewrite. And I think, relationships with publishers is, writing is about relationships. It really is. It's relationships with your publisher, relationship with your editor, relationship with your readers, of course, most important of all. But you kind of get an idea for how you work, and if they trust you and you trust them, then it can be a very, very productive way of writing. But starting out, I mean, I have no idea how I'd start out now,
Mm-hmm. I feel that the industry now is much more, it is much more regimented. I think because it just seems to be busier generally in terms of the number of submissions that they're dealing with and things like that. So maybe it needs to be like that. But I can imagine Jasper Fforde starting today might have more difficulty with that process in terms of pitching things and things like that, because you don't have that built up relationship.
I think maybe are publishers more risk averse these days? I think as bottom lines perhaps become tighter, maybe. I mean, books are still selling, and I'd like to think, giving advice to writers about not writing to market is there is always room for some writer who is extremely off kilter and has a kind of worldview that, I mean, put it this way, when I'm reading, or when I'm, involved in, I don't know, sort of visual arts or anything like that, what I really want to see, and I think this, this clues into a lot, is I want to see skills I don't have and ideas I couldn't have, skills I don't possess and ideas I could not have. Do you know how there's something very, very satisfying about watching a bricklayer who has the skill of being a really good bricklayer, or even like scaffolders, when they can just
in
wang
2
it
seconds
together.
they can put it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and those are skills I don't possess. So it interests me. That really does interest me. Ideas I could not have. And I think that's why many people sort of go to modern art perhaps and think, well, I could have thought that, and you go, yeah, I think that's the problem. You want really, really good original ideas that you could not possibly have had. And that's what's exciting. And I think that will excite editors and publishers too. That if you write a book that an editor reads and they read the first paragraph and there's something in there that makes them go, I would not have thought of that. Right. And then they read more and they get to the end of the first chapter and they go, okay, there was some stuff in there that I just would not have considered. I think you're on a winner.
Yeah.
But it's fine.
I think that's absolutely right. I think every editor, absolutely, they'll all say that. They'll all say they want something new, something exciting. But the trouble is, in our experience of speaking to people and stuff, it seems that as you said, the industry as a whole is pretty risk averse. So yes, while some people that do that will land it in the right hands at the right time and it will be captured, I think it can be difficult to get people to take a risk on that type of writing nowadays, which is a shame, as you say, because it's what everyone actually wants. When you do read something, when you go and see a film that you think, God, that was just like nothing I've ever seen before or something, then it's a different experience. It's a better experience, definitely.
Yeah. So I have this sort of saying, which I think is a bit cynical, really, but it's mediocre is the new good. And I think there's a lot of stuff, if you search around, there's some of the streamers where they're just going for volume rather than quality, and I think that's a worry, and I think people are accepting mediocre rather than good, and quality will always out. And if you're writing quality work which is different and off kilter and unusual, I'd like to think there would be a market somewhere for it. Or if that first one doesn't work, then maybe the second, third, fourth,
Yeah,
or sixth, you know.
absolutely. And I was going to say as well that often we hear, if a book doesn't sell or whatever, you should never get rid of it entirely. And I think in your case, that is very much the case, because obviously you were querying, you said, with these different books. You had the Nursery Crime Division, you had the Last Dragonslayer and stuff, and those books, I'm sure they were very different by the time they came out, but you did go back to them and they did get published eventually.
Yeah, I think that's important too. I mean, I had this nice idea in the Fourth Bear, which was a First World War theme park called Somworld, which I really liked because it has a dark sort of satirical sort of edge to it, that you dress up as, and I think it's all jolly good fun to dress up as a, soldier and then put in the trenches and then be, put under a mortar bombardment for an hour. And I really liked that idea, and it was a book that was not being published, and I was writing other books that were being published, and it was very tempting to just rip out Somworld and use it in a book that was being published. But I thought, no, let's leave that. Don't salvage stuff from books unless they're completely, awful. Just keep it, because you never know. You never know. Because that's what happened, is after I'd written, I think, whatever it was, maybe two or three books in the Thursday Next series, they said, have you got anything else? And I go, well, I've got these police procedurals. And all of a sudden they were listening.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, that sounds rather fun. And I went back to, and I kind of thought in my sort of childish naivety that I'd just have to take them off the hard drive, blow off the electrons and run a spell checker over it. And it was quite a revelation to realize that The Fourth Bear and Big Over Easy were really not very good at all. They were good ideas for books, but they weren't good books. And it took me just as long to rewrite them and bring them up to quality. So that was a bit of a sort of, humbling moment. But I think I'd learned something,
Yeah.
And just rewrote them, and they were much, much improved.
And let's chat about your latest book then, which is Redside Story. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that book's about and how it fits into the series it's part of?
Yeah, so Redside Story. So Redside Story is a book, a sequel to a book I wrote called Shades of Grey, which came out in 2011, I think. This was my seventh book. So I'd done 4 in the Thursday Next literary detective series, 2 in the Nursery crime series. And they were very much using characters that already existed. So they were very referential, if you like. So for my 7th book, I thought, well, I'll write a book which is my own, with my own characters, my own situations, and you just have a bit of fun with it and make some totally off-kilter nonsense up and see where it took me. So Shades of Grey was essentially a sort of a future dystopia set in a world in which the hierarchy is based on the colours that you can see, right? So if you can see a lot of red, you're the red prefect. If you can see a lot of green prefect, etc. And the achromatic greys, the people who can see no colour at all, are at the bottom of the social heap. And I thought, let's have someone with arrive in a village, East Carmine, everything's named after colours, and have them arrive in this village and be sort of shown that the world that they thought was cosy and warm and accepting was nothing of the sort. So it's a bit of a love story. It's a bit of social satire, but it is quite speculative, and it's essentially a book based entirely on visual color. If visual color was the most important thing in our lives, how would the world look? Anyway, so I wrote this book, and it didn't find, the sort of massive sales I was kind of hoping. I hoped that, that awards and fame and riches beyond my wildest dreams, avarice, would, follow swiftly on. That didn't happen. The people who read it, the reviews were pretty good, and the people who read it liked it, but it just did not sell. So it kind of fell into abeyance. And then about 5 or 6 years later, people started sending me emails saying, "Listen here, Jasper, when's the sequel going to be?" And all of a sudden, this book was not an unwanted child. There were people there who actually really, really liked it, not just the favorite of my books, but very generously saying that it was one of their favorite books. So I thought, well, that's pretty good. Anyway, so I decided to write the sequel, and that came out, Redside Story. It's a direct sequel and just carries on from where Eddie Russet and Jane Grey, where they left off, and it just reveals more about the world, about the place of their world within the greater world, and lifts the curtain on some truths that were kind of staring them in the face. And it just carries on the story and sets ourselves up for the third in the series, which hopefully won't be another 13 years. It will be maybe 2 or 3 years down the line. But it's sorry, yeah, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, was it difficult to get back into the characters and stuff after such a long time away from them?
No, I had to reread the book about 3 times and make quite a few notes, so I knew where I was kind of going with it, and to get continuity right in my head, so I didn't go up any blind alleys. So that was kind of important. But once you it's very strange. But I mean, if you can imagine, if there's a room full of people that and like one's your mum and one's your partner, a child, someone you know quite well and like, someone you know quite well but don't like, you could bounce between them, and the way in which you talk to each will be uniquely different and perfect, because that's what we do as humans. We're very good at that sort of stuff. So once I was kind of in the characters and the situations, it became quite easy to speak for them and to know what they would do, what they wouldn't do, and the kind of characters that they were. So it felt quite easy falling back into them. And it was just quite nice developing those characters and taking them a little bit further, that the very, very confident Jane could maybe have a slight wobble, that Eddie is slightly more confident than he was in the first book, but he's not 100% sure either. So they take over different roles in their partnership, which I think is reflective of real partnerships. So I was developing them as partners, but then also, with the secondary characters, even the really panto villain ones that I had in the first book, I was kind of thought, let's give them a little bit of redemption. If we're gonna kill them off, let's have them redeem themselves just a little bit, because I never think that bad people are 100% bad. So yeah, it was good fun.
When you're writing a book that's a sequel to another book or part of a series, etc., how does that square with your process of writing, rewriting, letting the ideas grow and change, etc.? How do you write something which is simultaneously unique and different and exciting, but also still recognizably part of a series, or with the characters that haven't changed too much? How do you draw the line there?
Well, obviously, my characters can't do things that they wouldn't do in the first book. I mean, they can have revelations that could, I suppose, make them do something they wouldn't do, and they can be conflicted while they do it. But you're this is the big difference between series books and standalones, and each have their benefits. Standalones are great because you can just make up something new and exciting and weird and wonderful and different, and it doesn't matter. And series books are great because you're getting to develop characters in a different kind of way. So it's an interesting exercise, but it's also taking what's already there, because as I said, I kind of make things up as I go along. It's sometimes tricky to try to figure out, okay, where does this go? How can I actually take this story on? So I kind of leave myself in the first book little jumping off points, things that I kind of vaguely know what's going to happen with, and then I kind of run with those. I call it the no plan, which is another one of the tenets. It's a good one for writing a series, but if you don't know really where the series is going, then just kind of give yourself little indicators that you can use and exploit in the later book. The ones that you use, people remember. The ones you don't use, people don't.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So
So it's
don't
quite
always have a
tricky. That
plan for book 3, 4, 5, but just give yourself tons of options, and you can pick and choose which ones to follow up on later on.
Yeah, you kind of need a vague idea. I mean, the Redside Story does go where I wanted it to go. It's just how it kind of gets there that you can really play with it. And things that you really like from the first book, you can then use those, use those more. And the ideas that you didn't like or which don't really fit in with the second book, you just ignore or explain away in a couple of sentences.
And to change tack slightly, but I did want to ask before we finish the podcast about in preparing questions for you, we took a look at your website, which is, I think it's fair to say, the most unique author website I've seen in a while. It's based on. Like if you were on the internet in 1990, I think roughly. I mean, why have you decided to keep that approach as opposed to sort of a snazzy new look that many authors have?
I mean, the thing about my website. So this is jasperfforde.com. So this went live in 2000, I think. So very early on in the life of the internet. So I think there were 30 million websites on the internet when that went live. And I've just and I wrote I either or myself and my partner have written every single page. There's no part of that hasn't been done by me or us. And I think it's a very direct. It is very much directly me to the reader. And as I sort of went on, and there were possibilities of upgrading it to some Squarespacey, all singing, all dancing, and I'd have to hand it over to someone else and they'd go, what would I do with this? Because there's all kinds of little Easter eggs there and references to this and that and the other. And I thought, no, I'll just leave it. And you can look at my website and see how websites looked in 2004 up until, about 2009, I suppose, when they really started getting all singing, all dancing. And it's HTML, which is, I know HTML. I can just write it in its source code. And it's so easy to debug. It's so easy to upgrade. And also there's nothing between me, because if I handed it over to someone else, I'd have to say, this is kind of what I want to do, and they'd interpret what I want to do. But when I'm writing it, I can just do whatever I want with it. So it's kind of little flying amber of how the internet used to look like. And it's huge. If I had it's like, I think it's got about 1,700 different pages, and some of them I haven't even looked at, and some of them only have like one way in, the deepest dark. There's only one, markup link that takes you to a particular page, and that's on another page that's only got like 2 entries into it. You could explore my website for like days.
Ready Player One. It's definitely
all the pages.
A story there.
Yeah. So, and I think it's a bit of fun, and I think it reflects me. I think it reflects my books, and it just about works for mobiles and tablets as well. I do have to change things every now and again, and scrunch things in a little bit so it's legible. But no, I'll keep it as it is.
Cool. And so what have you got? So Redside Story's out now. What is in the pipeline?
Well, in the pipeline, I've got. I've still got to launch in the US with Soho Press, who very generously given me a platform back in the US because my early books did very well over there. So I'm very glad to be going back there, I must say. But what I'm doing at the moment is working on what I call TN8, which is Thursday Next 8, the Dark Reading Matter. And this is the 8th and probably final in the Thursday Next series. And Dark Reading Matter is the sort of idea that the observable book verse, the amount of reading that we could find is only calculated to be maybe 20% of the amount of actual reading matter that is out there, and the rest of it is the dark reading matter that you can't see, that is invisible. and what if you could get in there? What if you could exploit that, and what is in there? So I think that's I've been building up, to the dark reading matter, which I really rather like that
That's
idea.
a great idea. I love the sound of that.
Over the last, yeah, it's kind of fun, isn't it? Over the last couple of books, so I'll exploit that, and it's obviously it's a nod to dark matter, and I'll certainly be looking at alternative realities and all kinds of interesting, multiverse physics in my own unique kind of slightly mangling way. But it's going quite well at the moment. So we'll see how it turns out.
Excellent. What was the last book that you read?
The last book I finished, or the last book I read. I'm really terrible when it comes to not finishing books. It's really bad. The last book I read was The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, isn't it? If memory serves. I was kind of doing a sort of SF masterwork thing, so I was bouncing between. I came from the Left Hand of Darkness, the Le Guin book, and then I went on to Joe Haldeman. That was the last one I read, which I really liked, actually. I thought that was really good. I mean, it's very obviously kind of Starship Troopers, really, but I just thought it had a bit more passion in it, and I love the relationship that he has with actually his real life wife and partner, Joe's real life wife and partner. So I think that was really nice, and I really rather liked it. And it was his reflections on the Vietnam War, because he was a Vietnam veteran. So I think that was all part of it. And yeah, I really like that.
What about the last film that you watched?
Last film that I watched. Let me think. It was something terrible. I can't remember what it was. I've got to tell you the next one I will watch. I got to rewatch Dune 1, because then I can go and watch Dune.
I'm the same. I've got to watch the first.
Yeah, so I can't watch Dune 2 until Dune 1. I mean, for many readers, for many writers, and especially if you like science fiction, obviously Dune is a big part of that. Keys into a lot of Star Wars, obviously. And it's just such a fantastically rich and real book and world, and I was really sort of, I like the original Dune, that was made back in the 80s. I like that, but this Dune is very, very good. I think it kind of lacked the high camp that the first one had. If you remember Baron Harkonnen from the first Dune, he was repulsive in a very slightly comedic way, and I just felt that the new Baron Harkonnen was just kind of nasty and not repulsive. He needs to be repulsive, sort of shiny, sweaty, repulsive, and the way he leers at his own nephew, Sting coming out the shower, it is just adds to that, I just felt that was the real Baron Harkonnen. But the rest of it I love, and the fact they went for real ornithopters, which were with wings, which is the definition of an ornithopter after all. And I thought all that stuff, and it was just great, just really, really good. So I think that's the next film I'm going to be watching. Yeah, Dune. So
excellent. Dune 2. And what about TV shows? What are you watching?
TV shows. Well, at the moment, I'm watching The Gentleman.
Oh yeah, the Guy Ritchie
okay.
TV show.
Yeah, Guy Ritchie doing what Guy Ritchie does best.
Yeah,
and I mean, I'm a huge fan of Snatch. I think that's a great movie. It's like he got to remake Lock, Stock better and properly.
Yeah, and
I think the reason I like it, and the same reason I like the series, The Gentleman, the film, I thought was good as well. I think I like it because it's farce. It's high farce, high dark farce. It's situational sort of comedy farce that people get into very bad situations through no real fault of their own, and then eventually get out of it through no real sense of guile or intelligence or skill. And I think that's what was the beauty about Snatch, is you have these two characters who are just kind of semi-losers, and they get into a terrible pickle, and then they get out through no skill of their own. And I think that's kind of farce. And I really like that about, The Gentleman. I find that very, very watchable.
Yeah, I've not watched it yet, but no, it's on the list, definitely.
Well, the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and there's no right answers to most of these apart from perhaps one. But we'll start off with a kind of general easing you in with sci-fi or fantasy question.
I think it's got to be fantasy. Nice. Yeah. There's too much. I don't know. There's too much like bad sci-fi or hard sci-fi, and I think so. But fantasy, I kind of think the strike rate is perhaps a little bit better.
Nice.
I think. Yeah.
TV or cinema?
These days, I think TV. Sadly, I think cinema is trying too hard to try and get people off the streaming and the TV, and the quality is not there. And you have the mediocre is the new good issue. Don't get me started on Oppenheimer.
We watched that last weekend. I have to say, I really liked it. I went in with very low expectations because I'd heard a lot of people say it wasn't very good, but I thought it was very good.
Yeah, it was kind of two movies.
We actually watched over 2 nights, and we did 2 hours, and then up to the bomb.
Yeah, it was very long, and I felt it was 2 movies. It was how a flinty-looking guy in a hat made a bomb, and
what happened next. Yeah.
And then it was another movie about how his security was.
It did feel very, and I think, and I wonder if I'd watched it in one go, if it would have felt differently. But watching it over 2 nights was quite a nice way to do it. But no, I
and I think the second. Yeah, the second film about revoking the security, if it had been written by Aaron Sorkin and was 90 minutes, would have been just fantastic.
Drama type dialogue.
Yeah, but it did show us that Iron Man can actually act, because we do remember that. But before he was Iron Man, he was acting.
To see him in a role that's not just doing
being an actor. Oh, remember now? Yeah, of course. It was fantastic. Kiss, kiss, bang, bang. You remember all that stuff? It was great. And then he put this suit on and had pepper, and it was all nonsense. And it's can act after all. So, phew, what a relief. Yeah.
Let's go for music or no music when you're writing.
Music. I do like music when I'm writing. Nothing particularly. I just put it on shuffle and I just have it low in the background. So, a little bit of noise. Nice. Quite nice.
And night owl or early bird?
I think early bird. Early mornings are really, really nice because there's nothing going on. The phone doesn't ring. The children aren't wanting to. I have teenage girls, and I'm now, really my chief job actually is not a writer, but an on-demand taxi service, which I call Duber. So just called Duber, and that's what they do. It's like just go call. Oh, I need to be taking so and so. There's none of that. It's all nice and quiet, and there's nothing happening. And mornings are so beautiful. And I live in a lovely part of the world, and I can just look out the window, and I can see the mountains. And there was snow on them this morning, and sometimes there are deer in the field below the house. Deirdre, we call her. Yeah, Deirdre. So it's just very lovely, and there's just nothing happening. I just wander around, slob around, cup of coffee. Yeah. Yeah, morning.
Well, the very last question here is real book or ebook?
Real book or ebook? Interesting actually. Audio.
Okay.
Because when I discovered I was dyslexic and was chatting to someone about it, and they go, "Well, you must listen to everything on audio." I went, "Oh, is that a thing?" They went, "Yeah, do you not know that?" And I went, "No." And I started reading on audio.
Yeah.
And that's how I
love audiobooks.
And I listen to everything on audio now.
Mm-hmm.
So and it is reading.
I agree.
Yes,
totally
anyone
agree with that.
Yeah, it is reading. It is reading. So don't let anyone tell you it's not proper reading.
And sometimes they've got like multiple narrators. There'll be sound effects. It's almost like a drama, like a radio drama. Some of the adaptations.
Yeah, it is. I think maybe that's sort of maybe you cross the line when you get the dramatic reading. I don't know, but yeah, and if you get a good reader, it works really well. If you get a bad reader, that can be annoying because I like Bill Bryson. I like the Bill Bryson fact books. I'm not so big on his travel books. I like his fact books. But when he's reading it, they're great. But there's another person who reads his books as well, and I just doesn't work.
The narrator can definitely make a big difference to your enjoyment. Definitely. Well, thanks very much to Jasper for coming on to the podcast. I really enjoyed that, and I hope you did as well. As I said at the start, Redside Story is his latest one, and you can grab that now. We'll put a link in the podcast description for that one if you want to pick that up or pick up any of his other books. This is normally where we tell you about next week's guest. What I can tell you is that we are moving into a series of episodes which focus on industry experts, is I suppose a broad term for them, agents, editors, people like that are in the industry. We did a series of these before. They're all video interviews as well, so you can watch them on YouTube, and they were very popular with people, so hopefully they'll be of interest to you. Those will start either next week or possibly the week after. It just depends how much time I can devote to editing those interviews, but we've got some great agents and editors lined up for you, so I hope you do tune in for those ones. But if you enjoyed today's episode, please do take the time to rate and review us on your favourite podcast app, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast. Otherwise, if you want to get in touch, you can get in touch with us on most social media just by searching for @UKPage1, or you can send us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk. But otherwise, have a great week, and we'll speak to you next episode. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.